Ladies and gentlemen, today, we gather to talk about a story that, unfortunately, reflects a deep and painful reality. A reality where racism, abuse of power, and injustice still exist within the institutions meant to protect us. But this is also a story about standing up, about justice stepping in at the right moment, and about the power of unity in the face of discrimination. Imagine this: a black woman, simply going about her day, finds herself confronted by a police officer who sees her not as a citizen, not as a human being, but as a target for his prejudice. He escalates, his authority fueling his aggression, his racist beliefs blinding his duty to serve and protect. And just when he thinks he can act with impunity, justice walks in. Her husband, a sheriff, appearing in seconds, standing tall, ready to hold him accountable. This moment is not just about a single act of misconduct. It represents something much bigger. It highlights the dangers that black individuals, particularly black women, face when dealing with law enforcement. It exposes the unchecked biases that turn those with badges into threats instead of protectors. And it forces us to ask, how many times has a similar situation played out where no one was there to stop it? But this story also reminds us that there are those in law enforcement who will not stand for injustice, those who will challenge the corruption within their own ranks. This sheriff, this husband, didn't just protect his wife, he protected what is right. And that is exactly what we need to see more of: accountability, integrity, and the courage to stand up against wrongdoing, no matter where it comes from. The truth is, racism in policing is not an isolated issue. It is systemic. It has cost lives. It has left families shattered. And until we demand real change, until we ensure proper training, oversight, and accountability, we will continue to witness these horrific abuses of power. But there is hope. There is power in calling out injustice. There is power in demanding reform. There is power in standing together, just as this sheriff stood for his wife, to say, "We will not tolerate racism, brutality, or discrimination in law enforcement, or anywhere else." Let this story be more than just a shocking headline. Let it be a wake-up call. A reminder that change starts with us, by speaking up, by holding people accountable, and by ensuring that justice is not a privilege, but a right for all. Thank you. Racism and police brutality continue to be major societal issues, deeply rooted in history and still evident in our modern world. Across generations, we have seen a system that disproportionately targets black individuals, leaving them vulnerable to injustice, violence, and discrimination. The story of a racist police officer attempting to punch a black woman, only to be confronted by her sheriff husband, is more than just an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a much larger problem, a problem that has plagued communities, torn families apart, and fueled an ongoing fight for justice and equality. The mere existence of such an encounter speaks volumes about the power dynamics ingrained in law enforcement. It is a stark reminder that some officers do not see all citizens as equals. Some wear their badges not to serve and protect but to intimidate and dominate. The fact that a law enforcement officer would even consider assaulting an innocent black woman under the guise of authority exposes the deep-seated biases and unchecked aggression that have been allowed to fester within police departments for far too long. It is this very mindset that has led to countless cases of police brutality, many of which have ended in tragedy, sparking outrage, protests, and calls for change. When this officer moved to strike, he did so with the confidence of someone who believed there would be no consequences. He acted with the presumption that his badge would shield him from accountability, that his uniform would justify his actions, and that the system would protect him rather than the victim. This is what systemic racism in policing looks like: officers emboldened by a culture that too often turns a blind eye to misconduct, particularly when the victims are black. It is a culture that has allowed cases like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others to become devastating realities. But in this moment, justice arrived not in the form of the courts, not through a department review, but in the presence of a sheriff, one who not only wore the badge but truly upheld the principles of law and order. This sheriff was not just any man, he was the husband of the woman being targeted. In an instant, the power dynamic shifted. The aggressor, who had moved with reckless confidence, was suddenly faced with accountability. He was no longer just dealing with a civilian, someone he assumed he could overpower without consequence. He was now face to face with another officer, one who carried not only authority but a personal stake in ensuring justice was served. This moment is significant for many reasons. First, it highlights the importance of good officers, those who understand that their duty is not to oppress but to protect. It proves that within the system, there are individuals who refuse to let racism and brutality define law enforcement. This sheriff did not hesitate to step in, not just because it was his wife being targeted, but because it was the right thing to do. His presence alone disrupted the narrative that officers are untouchable, that they can act on their prejudices without repercussions. It also exposes the fear that so many black individuals feel when encountering law enforcement. What if her husband had not been there? What if there had been no witnesses? How often do situations like this play out without intervention, leading to far more devastating outcomes? The truth is, many black men and women do not have a sheriff husband arriving in seconds to stop the violence. Many find themselves at the mercy of a system that does not always work in their favor. The fear of a routine stop escalating into a life-threatening encounter is real. The knowledge that calling for help may not always lead to safety is a burden carried by countless black families. This case also challenges the idea that all officers stand together, regardless of right and wrong. There is an unspoken code among law enforcement, one that discourages officers from speaking out against their colleagues. This culture of silence has allowed racism and brutality to persist for decades, with officers rarely held accountable for their actions. But this sheriff defied that code. He stood up against one of his own because loyalty to justice mattered more than loyalty to a uniform. That is the kind of leadership that is needed within law enforcement. Leaders who recognize that accountability is not betrayal, that calling out wrongdoing is not weakness but strength. Furthermore, this incident forces us to examine the structures that allow such behavior to exist in the first place. Racism in policing is not just about individual officers who harbor prejudice, it is about a system that has historically criminalized blackness. It is about policies that disproportionately target black communities, about training that prioritizes force over de-escalation, and about a judicial system that too often fails to hold officers accountable. It is not enough to remove one bad cop when the system itself breeds and protects them. There must be reform. Real, meaningful reform that goes beyond surface level promises. Departments must be willing to root out officers who use their positions to harm rather than protect. There must be stricter consequences for misconduct, independent investigations into allegations of abuse, and better training to eliminate racial bias. But beyond policy changes, there must be a shift in culture. Officers must be held to a higher standard. They must be reminded that their badges do not grant them unchecked power but rather a responsibility to serve all citizens equally and fairly. This story is also a reminder that racism is not always hidden behind slurs and overt acts of violence. It exists in the everyday interactions that black individuals have with police. It is in the way they are followed in stores, in the assumptions made about their character, in the way their concerns are dismissed, and in the fear that even an encounter with law enforcement could turn deadly. Racism is in the hesitance some officers show in assisting black victims, in the way cases involving black individuals are handled, and in the way black lives are often seen as less valuable. The role of bystanders in these situations cannot be ignored. In this case, the presence of a sheriff changed the outcome, but what about the countless other times when witnesses are powerless? There is a responsibility for society to speak out, to hold those in power accountable, and to demand better from those who are supposed to serve and protect. Silence is complicity, and ignoring these injustices only allows them to continue. Communities must come together to demand transparency, to push for body cameras, to ensure that those who misuse their authority are held accountable. But it is not just about accountability, it is also about justice for the victims. Too often, even when wrongdoing is exposed, justice is slow, and consequences are minimal. Families are left mourning loved ones while the officers responsible continue their careers with little more than a slap on the wrist. This cannot continue. There must be real consequences for officers who abuse their power, just as there are consequences for civilians who break the law. No badge should provide immunity from justice. Education is another crucial factor. The public must be informed about their rights, about how to safely navigate encounters with law enforcement, and about the importance of recording and reporting incidents of abuse. Knowledge is power, and awareness can save lives. But beyond individual knowledge, there must be collective efforts to educate law enforcement officers on racial bias, on community engagement, and on how to rebuild the trust that has been broken between police and the communities they are meant to serve. This moment, where a racist officer was stopped in his tracks, should serve as both a wake-up call and an example. It is a wake-up call to the fact that racism in policing is still very real, that officers are still acting on their biases, and that too many are still getting away with it. But it is also an example of how change can happen. When good officers refuse to be silent, when communities refuse to accept injustice, and when individuals are willing to stand up against wrongdoing, real progress can be made. The fight against racism and police brutality is far from over, but every act of resistance, every demand for justice, and every step toward accountability brings us closer to a future where these stories are no longer the norm. A black woman faces unjust aggression from a racist police officer, an incident that serves as yet another grim reminder of the deep-seated racial biases that persist in law enforcement. Across history, black individuals, particularly black women, have been subjected to unjust treatment by officers who misuse their power to enforce prejudice rather than justice. This case exemplifies the ongoing struggle against systemic racism, revealing the fear, trauma, and indignation that countless black women experience when confronted with law enforcement. When the officer approached her, there was no provocation, no reason for hostility, yet his demeanor was aggressive from the start. His words were laced with condescension, his posture rigid with intimidation, and his actions suggested that he had already made up his mind about who she was and how he was going to treat her. He saw not a citizen deserving of respect but a target for his unchecked authority. The situation escalated with alarming speed, not because she resisted, but because he saw her existence as a challenge to his control. The way he reached for her, the way his fists clenched, spoke volumes about his intent. It was an act of racial aggression disguised as law enforcement. The officer's attempt to punch her was not just an individual act of violence, it was a symbol of the wider issue at hand. This was not a moment of impulsive anger, it was a calculated exertion of power, the kind of power that too many officers believe they can wield without consequence. He did not see her as someone with rights, as someone with a voice, he saw her as someone he could subdue. But in that crucial moment, justice intervened, not in the form of legal accountability, but in the sudden appearance of her husband, a sheriff, a man who not only understood the law but was sworn to uphold it fairly. The instant her husband arrived, the tables turned. The racist officer, who had moved with arrogance and impunity, now found himself face to face with someone who had the authority to challenge him. He was no longer the most powerful man in the room, no longer able to act without fear of repercussions. The mere presence of another officer, one with integrity, shattered his illusion of invincibility. It was a moment of reckoning that too many racist officers avoid because their actions are often shielded by a system reluctant to punish its own. This encounter was not just about one woman and one officer, it was about the broader reality of what it means to be black in America, particularly when interacting with law enforcement. Black women, in particular, face a unique kind of vulnerability. They are often viewed through the lens of harmful stereotypes, seen as angry or defiant simply for asserting their rights. This perception makes them easy targets for officers who see their badges as licenses to act on their prejudices. Too many black women have been victims of police violence, their stories ignored or downplayed, their cries for justice drowned out by those who refuse to acknowledge the reality of racism in policing. But this case was different. This time, there was someone to stop the violence before it escalated further. This time, there was an officer who refused to stand by in silence. The sheriff did not hesitate to confront his fellow officer, to demand an explanation, to challenge the misuse of power unfolding before him. His actions sent a clear message: being a police officer does not place one above the law. Those who abuse their authority must be held accountable, no matter their rank, no matter their uniform. Had the sheriff not arrived when he did, how might the situation have played out? Would this woman have been another statistic, another name on a growing list of black individuals harmed by those meant to protect? The reality is, for too many black women, there is no intervention, no sudden arrival of justice in the form of a loved one with authority. Instead, there is only fear, trauma, and an ongoing fight for accountability that too often ends in disappointment. This incident highlights the importance of good officers, those who refuse to turn a blind eye to injustice, who understand that their duty is not to protect fellow officers at all costs, but to uphold the law fairly and without bias. The sheriff's actions serve as a reminder that integrity within law enforcement is not impossible, but it requires courage. It requires a willingness to go against the unspoken code of silence that protects corrupt officers and allows racist practices to continue. It requires leaders within the force to demand better, to ensure that those who serve the public do so with honor rather than prejudice. This event also forces us to question why such incidents continue to occur. How many officers are operating with the same racist mindset as the one in this encounter? How many believe they can act without consequence simply because they wear a badge? And most importantly, what can be done to ensure that no more black women have to fear for their safety at the hands of those meant to protect them? Reform is necessary, but reform must be meaningful. It cannot be just about retraining. It must involve accountability, oversight, and a willingness to remove those who abuse their power. Officers who engage in racist behavior should not be given second chances, they should be removed from the force entirely. The presence of the sheriff in this case was a rare instance of immediate justice, but justice should not be dependent on luck. It should not take a personal connection to law enforcement for a black woman to be protected from violence. The system itself must change, and that change must come from within as well as from external pressure. The public must demand better, must refuse to accept these incidents as inevitable, must push for laws and policies that ensure officers who engage in racist misconduct are held accountable. This incident also serves as a wake-up call to society at large. It is not enough to be outraged in the moment. There must be sustained efforts to dismantle the structures that allow racism to thrive within policing. Community involvement is essential. Citizens must continue to push for transparency, for body cameras, for independent investigations into police misconduct. The fight against racism in law enforcement is not just about one officer, one department, or one city, it is a national crisis that requires collective action. For black women, the struggle is even greater. They face not only the racism embedded in the system but also the gendered aspect of discrimination. They are often overlooked in conversations about police violence, their experiences pushed aside in favor of narratives that focus primarily on black men. But their pain is real, their experiences are valid, and their voices must be heard. This story is a reminder that the fight against police brutality must be inclusive, that justice must extend to all who suffer under the weight of discrimination. Ultimately, this moment of confrontation between a racist officer and a sheriff who stood for justice is a symbol of the larger battle at hand. It is a battle between those who seek to use their power for oppression and those who demand accountability. It is a battle that must continue until black individuals, especially black women, can exist without fear of those sworn to protect them. It is a battle that requires courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice for all. Her sheriff husband intervenes, ensuring accountability and justice. The moment the racist officer raised his fist, prepared to strike a black woman who had done nothing to deserve such aggression, fate took an unexpected turn. Just as the officer's unchecked authority seemed poised to inflict another act of brutality, her husband, a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, appeared. His presence changed everything. No longer was this woman alone, defenseless against a system that so often fails to protect the vulnerable. This time, there was someone to challenge the abuse, to demand answers, to ensure that justice prevailed. The sheriff did not hesitate. His years of training, his commitment to integrity, and his understanding of the very laws that his fellow officer had so recklessly disregarded all guided his actions. He stepped forward with authority, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, halting the officer in his tracks. The racist officer's confidence wavered for the first time. Gone was the unchecked arrogance, the belief that he could act with impunity. Now, he was facing not just a victim, but a protector, someone who would not stand by and allow injustice to unfold before his eyes. The encounter between the two lawmen was tense. The sheriff demanded to know why his wife had been targeted, what justification there could possibly be for such hostility. The racist officer stammered, his earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. He struggled to explain his actions, knowing full well that there was no legitimate reason for his aggression. His usual shield, an institution that too often protects its own at the expense of truth, was no longer enough. This time, someone within the system was holding him accountable. It is a rare moment when law enforcement polices its own. All too often, officers who engage in racist misconduct are shielded by their colleagues, their actions dismissed or justified under the guise of maintaining order. But the sheriff was different. He knew that justice could not be selective, that accountability could not be reserved only for those without badges. His role was not to cover up the wrongdoings of others in uniform, but to uphold the principles of fairness and integrity that law enforcement is supposed to stand for. As the confrontation unfolded, bystanders watched in disbelief. Too many times, they had seen situations like this end in tragedy. Too many times, they had seen black individuals brutalized by police, their cries for justice ignored. But this time, something was different. This time, there was an intervention. Swift, decisive, and unyielding. The sheriff's presence alone disrupted the expected outcome. He was not just any man. He was a black man in a position of authority, challenging the very system that had long oppressed people who looked like him. His uniform, once a symbol of fear for many, became a symbol of hope. The racist officer's discomfort grew. He was used to having the upper hand, used to exercising power without challenge. But now, under the scrutiny of an equal, he found himself exposed. His actions, so easily justified in the past, were now laid bare for what they truly were: an abuse of power, fueled by racial bias. The sheriff, unwavering in his resolve, demanded accountability. He would not allow this moment to be swept under the rug. He would not allow his wife to become another statistic, another victim whose story was buried under bureaucratic excuses and institutional silence. The sheriff's intervention did more than just stop an act of violence, it forced a reckoning. It was a moment that demanded reflection, not just from those involved, but from the entire community. How many times had similar incidents occurred without intervention? How many victims had suffered in silence, without someone to stand up for them? The answer was too many. This case was a stark reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, that the battle against racism in law enforcement is far from over. For the black woman at the center of this ordeal, the presence of her husband meant more than just immediate safety. It meant validation. It meant that her fear, her anger, her trauma, everything she had felt in that moment, was acknowledged. Too often, black women are told that their experiences are exaggerated, that they are imagining the discrimination they face. But here was undeniable proof. Here was a man, not just her husband but an officer of the law, confirming that what had happened to her was wrong, that she deserved better, that justice was not a privilege but a right. The confrontation between the sheriff and the racist officer did not end with mere words. There had to be consequences. The sheriff ensured that a formal complaint was filed, that an investigation was opened, that the officer in question would not walk away without facing the repercussions of his actions. This was not about personal revenge, it was about setting a precedent. It was about sending a message that racism within law enforcement would not be tolerated, that officers who abused their power would be held accountable. In the days that followed, the case gained attention. The community rallied behind the sheriff and his wife, their voices demanding justice not just for her, but for all those who had suffered similar fates. The incident sparked conversations about the role of police in black communities, about the need for reform, about the importance of having officers who are willing to challenge their own ranks when necessary. It became a catalyst for change, a moment that would not be forgotten. For the sheriff, this was more than just a duty. It was personal. He knew that his wife's experience was not unique, that countless black women had faced similar or worse encounters. He knew that his role as an officer did not exempt him from the realities of being black in America. His intervention was not just an act of love for his wife, but an act of defiance against a system that too often dehumanizes black lives. The racist officer, once so sure of his power, now faced the consequences of his actions. Whether it was disciplinary action, termination, or legal ramifications, he would no longer operate with the same unchecked authority. His actions had been exposed, his prejudice brought to light. This was justice in action. Perhaps not the complete dismantling of systemic racism, but a step in the right direction. But beyond this single incident, the sheriff's intervention highlighted a larger truth. Real change requires those within the system to challenge it from within. It requires officers who are willing to stand up against their colleagues when they see wrongdoing. It requires individuals who prioritize justice over loyalty to a corrupt status quo. This is the kind of policing that communities deserve, one that protects rather than persecutes, one that serves rather than subjugates. The sheriff's actions serve as a reminder that accountability is possible. That even within a flawed system, there are those who will fight for what is right. But it should not take a personal connection to law enforcement for a black woman to receive justice. The system itself must change. Policies must be reformed, biases must be addressed, and those who misuse their power must be removed from positions where they can cause harm. This incident is more than just a story of a husband protecting his wife. It is a testament to the power of intervention, to the necessity of accountability, and to the ongoing struggle for racial justice. It is a moment that forces us to confront the realities of policing in America, to ask difficult questions, and to demand better from those who are sworn to serve and protect. Systemic bias in law enforcement puts black lives at risk. The reality of racism within policing is not just a matter of individual prejudice but a deeply embedded issue within the structures of the justice system. Throughout history, black communities have been disproportionately targeted, harassed, and subjected to violence by those meant to protect them. The presence of systemic bias means that from routine traffic stops to major criminal investigations, black individuals face greater scrutiny, harsher punishments, and an increased risk of becoming victims of police brutality. These biases are reinforced by policies, training, and unwritten codes of conduct that allow discriminatory practices to continue unchecked. For black individuals, encounters with law enforcement often carry an inherent sense of fear and uncertainty. Data consistently shows that black drivers are more likely to be stopped and searched compared to their white counterparts, despite no evidence suggesting higher rates of wrongdoing. In many instances, black individuals are treated as threats first and citizens second. The racial profiling that pervades policing leads to wrongful arrests, unnecessary use of force, and tragic fatalities that should never have occurred. These incidents are not isolated but are part of a larger pattern that reveals the persistent nature of racial bias in law enforcement. Police departments across the country operate under a culture that, in many cases, protects officers who engage in discriminatory behavior. The so-called blue wall of silence discourages officers from speaking out against their colleagues, allowing misconduct to go unreported and unpunished. Officers who do report misconduct often face retaliation, reinforcing a culture of silence that shields racist behavior from scrutiny. This system enables officers with prejudiced mindsets to continue targeting black communities without fear of consequences. Meanwhile, black officers who attempt to bring about change from within frequently encounter discrimination themselves, further proving that racism is not just a community issue but an institutional one as well. The legal system further exacerbates this issue by providing protections that make it difficult to hold officers accountable. Qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that shields government officials from lawsuits unless clear violations of constitutional rights are proven, often allows officers to evade responsibility for their actions. Even in cases where there is video evidence of police misconduct, the legal hurdles required to achieve justice remain daunting. Prosecutors, who work closely with police departments, are often reluctant to press charges against officers, resulting in a system where accountability is the exception rather than the norm. Training programs within police academies also play a significant role in perpetuating systemic bias. Officers are often taught to prioritize compliance over community engagement, leading to an over-reliance on force as a first response rather than a last resort. The militarization of police forces has only worsened this issue, equipping officers with military-grade weapons and vehicles that create an environment of hostility rather than protection. Black communities, in particular, bear the brunt of aggressive policing tactics, which often escalate minor infractions into deadly confrontations. Media coverage of police violence has brought national attention to these injustices, yet the problem persists. The deaths of individuals such as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others have sparked protests and calls for reform, but meaningful change remains slow. Body cameras, while intended to provide transparency, often fail to hold officers accountable due to tampering, selective recording, or refusal to release footage. Even when evidence is available, the legal system frequently fails to deliver justice, reinforcing the belief that black lives are undervalued in the eyes of the law. The racial disparities in policing extend beyond violent encounters. Black individuals are disproportionately arrested and incarcerated for nonviolent offenses, contributing to mass incarceration that devastates families and communities. Sentencing disparities further illustrate the systemic nature of these issues, with black defendants receiving harsher punishments than white defendants for the same crimes. These patterns highlight the fact that bias in law enforcement is not just about individual racist officers but about a system that is designed to enforce racial hierarchies. Efforts to address systemic bias in policing have been met with resistance. Calls to defund the police and redirect funding to social services have been dismissed by many as radical, despite evidence suggesting that community-based initiatives and mental health resources reduce crime more effectively than aggressive policing. Police unions, which wield significant political influence, often fight against reform efforts, protecting officers with histories of misconduct and blocking legislation aimed at increasing accountability. The resistance to change highlights the deep-rooted nature of these issues and the challenges in dismantling a system built on racial disparities. The presence of black officers within police forces has not been enough to mitigate systemic bias. While diversity within law enforcement is important, it does not erase the broader structural issues that enable racism to persist. Black officers often face discrimination from their own departments, and those who attempt to challenge racist practices can find themselves ostracized or even forced out of their positions. True reform requires more than just increasing diversity, it requires dismantling the policies and cultures that allow bias to thrive. Community-led policing has emerged as a potential solution to the issue of systemic bias. By prioritizing relationships between officers and the communities they serve, some programs have successfully reduced instances of violence and increased trust. However, these initiatives are often underfunded and lack the institutional support necessary to be fully effective. For lasting change, law enforcement agencies must be willing to engage in genuine reform rather than surface-level measures that fail to address the root causes of racial disparities in policing. The historical roots of systemic bias in law enforcement cannot be ignored. Policing in the United States has origins in slave patrols, which were designed to control and oppress black populations. These racist foundations have continued to shape modern policing practices, with black communities being disproportionately targeted for surveillance, arrests, and violence. Recognizing this history is essential to understanding why systemic bias persists and why it requires more than just policy adjustments to dismantle. Activists and organizations have long pushed for police reform, advocating for changes such as ending qualified immunity, implementing independent oversight committees, and increasing transparency within law enforcement. While some progress has been made, many of these efforts face significant pushback from political leaders and law enforcement agencies that are resistant to change. The fight for racial justice within policing requires persistent pressure from communities, lawmakers, and advocacy groups to overcome these obstacles. The psychological impact of systemic bias in law enforcement on black communities cannot be overstated. The trauma of witnessing or experiencing police violence takes a toll on mental health, leading to heightened levels of stress, anxiety, and distrust in the justice system. The fear of being targeted by police affects daily life, influencing decisions such as where to live, how to interact in public spaces, and even how to dress. This ongoing psychological burden further illustrates why systemic bias in policing is not just a legal issue but a public health crisis. Education and awareness play crucial roles in addressing systemic bias. Many people remain unaware of the full extent of racial disparities in policing, often believing that these issues are exaggerated or isolated incidents. By highlighting data, sharing personal testimonies, and amplifying the voices of those affected, the movement for justice can continue to gain momentum. Public pressure has proven to be an effective tool in demanding change, as seen in cases where protests have led to policy shifts and officer indictments that otherwise would not have occurred. Addressing systemic bias in law enforcement requires a multifaceted approach that includes policy reform, community engagement, and cultural shifts within police departments. It is not enough to acknowledge the problem. Action must be taken to dismantle the structures that allow discrimination to persist. This includes revisiting hiring practices, reevaluating training methods, and holding officers accountable for misconduct. Without systemic change, the cycle of racial injustice within policing will continue, endangering black lives and eroding trust in the justice system. The responsibility for change does not rest solely on lawmakers or activists, it is a societal issue that requires collective effort. Allies must speak out against injustices, support legislation aimed at reforming law enforcement, and challenge the narratives that justify racial bias in policing. The goal is not just to reduce incidents of police violence but to create a system that truly serves and protects all individuals, regardless of race. By confronting the reality of systemic bias and working towards meaningful change, it is possible to build a future where Black lives are not disproportionately at risk due to the very institutions meant to protect them. More officers must uphold integrity and challenge corruption within their ranks. In law enforcement, integrity should be a fundamental principle, ensuring that officers serve their communities with fairness and justice. Unfortunately, corruption remains a persistent issue, undermining the trust between police departments and the communities they are sworn to protect. Officers who fail to uphold integrity contribute to systemic issues, allowing racism, excessive force, and misconduct to go unchecked. Challenging corruption within the ranks is not only a moral duty but a necessity for creating a just and equitable society. One of the key barriers to addressing corruption in law enforcement is the blue wall of silence. This unspoken rule discourages officers from reporting the misconduct of their colleagues, fostering a culture of impunity. Officers who do step forward to expose wrongdoing often face retaliation, including career setbacks, ostracization, or even threats to their safety. This culture makes it difficult to hold corrupt officers accountable, as fear and peer pressure discourage honest cops from speaking out. Breaking this wall of silence requires both institutional reforms and cultural shifts within police departments. Accountability mechanisms must be strengthened to ensure that officers who engage in corruption face real consequences. Independent oversight committees, civilian review boards, and whistleblower protections are crucial steps in breaking down the barriers that shield misconduct. Without these checks in place, officers who engage in unethical behavior often go unpunished, reinforcing a system that allows injustice to persist. Transparency is another key factor. Requiring police departments to make disciplinary records publicly accessible can help build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Another critical issue is the role of police unions in protecting corrupt officers. While unions are meant to advocate for officers' rights, they often fight against accountability measures, making it difficult to fire officers with histories of misconduct. Police unions have been known to negotiate contracts that limit internal investigations, delay disciplinary actions, and reinstate officers who were previously terminated for serious offenses. Reforming these policies is necessary to ensure that unions do not stand in the way of justice and accountability. Training within police academies must emphasize ethics, de-escalation, and cultural sensitivity. Too often, officers are trained to view civilians, especially Black individuals, as potential threats rather than community members deserving of respect. This training fosters an us versus them mentality, leading to excessive use of force and biased decision making. Officers must be educated on the historical context of policing, including its roots in racial oppression, so they can actively work to dismantle systemic discrimination. Anti-bias training should be mandatory and ongoing to ensure that officers continuously reflect on their behavior and decision making. Corruption in law enforcement is not just about individual officers, it is deeply embedded within the structures and policies that govern policing. Racial profiling, for instance, is a systemic issue that disproportionately targets Black individuals for stops, searches, and arrests. Data consistently shows that Black drivers are more likely to be pulled over and searched than white drivers, despite no evidence of higher rates of illegal activity. These biased practices erode trust in law enforcement and contribute to the perception that officers are not serving all communities equally. The presence of good officers is crucial in challenging corruption, but they must be empowered to take action. Officers who witness misconduct should have clear avenues to report it without fear of retaliation. Internal affairs divisions must be independent and transparent, rather than serving as mere bureaucratic entities that shield officers from scrutiny. Furthermore, departments must actively encourage a culture where integrity is valued over blind loyalty, reinforcing the idea that reporting misconduct is a duty rather than a betrayal. Body cameras have been introduced as a tool for transparency, yet they are only as effective as the policies governing their use. Many departments have been criticized for selectively using footage, refusing to release videos that may expose wrongdoing, or even allowing officers to turn cameras off at critical moments. Strict policies must be implemented to ensure that body cameras are always active during interactions with civilians, and that footage is readily available for independent review. This measure can help deter misconduct and provide evidence in cases where officers engage in corrupt or abusive behavior. Community involvement in police oversight is another essential step toward reform. Civilian review boards should have the authority to investigate allegations of misconduct, subpoena records, and recommend disciplinary actions. Many communities have successfully implemented these boards, yet their effectiveness often depends on whether they have real power or if they serve as mere symbolic gestures. Ensuring that these boards are independent and well funded is necessary to hold police departments accountable. The influence of politics in law enforcement cannot be ignored. Many police chiefs and sheriffs are elected or appointed based on political considerations rather than their commitment to reform. Political leaders who refuse to hold corrupt officers accountable enable misconduct to persist. Advocates for police reform must push for leaders who prioritize integrity, transparency, and community engagement. Electing officials who support meaningful changes in policing policies is crucial to dismantling systemic corruption. At the federal level, legislation must be enacted to address police misconduct on a broader scale. While local reforms are important, systemic issues require national oversight to ensure that departments across the country adhere to ethical standards. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, for example, proposed several reforms aimed at increasing accountability, banning chokeholds, and restricting qualified immunity for officers. However, such measures often face significant opposition from political groups that prioritize law enforcement interests over justice. Ending corruption within police departments requires addressing the militarization of law enforcement. The excessive use of military-grade weapons and tactics creates an environment of hostility rather than safety. Black communities, in particular, have been disproportionately affected by aggressive policing tactics such as no-knock warrants, SWAT raids, and the use of armored vehicles in routine operations. Demilitarizing the police and shifting the focus toward community-based policing can help rebuild trust and reduce unnecessary confrontations. The media plays a significant role in shaping public perceptions of law enforcement. Biased reporting often portrays black individuals as criminals while painting corrupt officers as isolated, bad apples. This narrative minimizes the systemic nature of police misconduct and reinforces harmful stereotypes. Holding media outlets accountable for fair and accurate reporting is essential in changing public perceptions and ensuring that stories of police corruption receive the attention they deserve. Documenting and amplifying the voices of victims of police misconduct can bring greater awareness to the issue. Social activism has been a driving force in pushing for police reform. Protests, advocacy campaigns, and grassroots movements have played a crucial role in exposing misconduct and demanding change. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has brought national attention to the injustices faced by black communities at the hands of law enforcement. While critics attempt to dismiss these movements as anti-police, the reality is that they are advocating for a fair and just system where law enforcement serves all citizens equally. Addressing corruption within law enforcement also requires changes in recruitment and hiring practices. Departments must conduct thorough background checks to ensure that new recruits do not have histories of misconduct, racism, or violence. Psychological evaluations should assess candidates' ability to handle the responsibilities of the job ethically and without bias. Additionally, recruitment efforts should focus on hiring officers who are committed to community-oriented policing rather than those who seek power and control. Education plays a critical role in long-term reform. Schools and universities should incorporate lessons on policing, systemic racism, and civil rights into their curricula. Teaching future generations about the impact of police corruption and the importance of accountability can help foster a culture of transparency and justice. Encouraging civic engagement and educating citizens on their rights during police interactions can also empower communities to demand fair treatment. Ultimately, law enforcement should reflect the values of the communities they serve. Departments must move away from punitive models of policing and instead adopt strategies that prioritize de-escalation, mental health interventions, and restorative justice. The reliance on force and intimidation has not made communities safer. Instead, it has deepened mistrust and perpetuated cycles of violence. A shift in policing philosophy is necessary to create a system that truly serves and protects all citizens, regardless of race. Reforming law enforcement requires a collective effort from officers, lawmakers, activists, and citizens. It is not enough for individual officers to uphold integrity, the entire system must be restructured to eliminate corruption and bias. Through continued advocacy, policy changes, and cultural shifts, it is possible to build a future where law enforcement operates with transparency, accountability, and fairness for all. Real change requires collective action, accountability, and reform. Throughout history, significant transformations in society have only occurred when individuals come together to demand justice and equity. The issue of police misconduct, particularly involving racist officers who abuse their power, is a deep-rooted problem that requires a unified effort to address. It is not enough to simply acknowledge the issue. Action must be taken at every level to dismantle corruption and ensure that law enforcement serves all communities fairly and without bias. Collective action has long been a powerful force in addressing social injustices. From the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter protests, history shows that meaningful change happens when people unite to challenge oppressive systems. Public demonstrations, advocacy campaigns, and community organizing have played crucial roles in exposing police brutality and holding officers accountable. By amplifying the voices of those affected by police misconduct, these movements push for policy changes that prioritize justice over systemic oppression. Accountability is a key component of meaningful reform. Without mechanisms to hold corrupt officers responsible for their actions, misconduct will continue unchecked. Law enforcement agencies must implement strict oversight policies to ensure that officers who engage in racial profiling, excessive force, or corruption face real consequences. Internal affairs divisions must be independent and transparent, rather than serving as protective shields for problematic officers. The establishment of civilian review boards with the authority to investigate misconduct and recommend disciplinary actions is essential to restoring public trust in the police. Reforming law enforcement requires a comprehensive approach that addresses both institutional structures and individual behaviors. Police training programs must emphasize de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, and ethical decision-making. The militarization of police forces must be re-evaluated to prevent the excessive use of force against marginalized communities. Additionally, recruitment efforts should focus on hiring individuals who are committed to community-oriented policing rather than those who seek power and control. The role of police unions in protecting officers accused of misconduct must also be examined. While unions play an important role in advocating for fair wages and working conditions, they often resist efforts to hold officers accountable. Some police unions have been known to negotiate contracts that limit internal investigations, delay disciplinary actions, and reinstate officers who were previously terminated for serious offenses. Reforming these policies is necessary to ensure that unions do not stand in the way of justice and accountability. Community involvement in policing decisions is another critical factor in enacting lasting change. Civilian oversight boards should have the authority to review cases of police misconduct and provide input on department policies. Additionally, initiatives that promote collaboration between law enforcement and community members can help rebuild trust and foster better relationships. Programs that encourage officers to engage with residents in non-enforcement settings, such as community meetings and youth mentorship programs, can humanize both sides and create a more cooperative dynamic. Technology can also play a role in increasing accountability within law enforcement. Body cameras, for example, provide an additional layer of transparency by recording interactions between officers and civilians. However, for these tools to be effective, departments must establish strict policies regarding their usage. Officers should not be allowed to turn cameras off at their discretion, and footage should be made available for independent review when misconduct allegations arise. Furthermore, the implementation of data-driven oversight systems can help identify patterns of abuse and prevent problematic officers from continuing to serve without consequences. At the legislative level, policies must be enacted to address police misconduct on a broader scale. Laws that eliminate qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shields officers from facing lawsuits for misconduct, would provide victims with greater access to justice. Federal and state governments must also implement standardized use of force policies that prioritize de-escalation and accountability. Additionally, increased funding for mental health crisis intervention teams can help reduce the reliance on armed officers in situations where alternative responses may be more appropriate. The influence of systemic racism in law enforcement cannot be ignored. Historical patterns of discriminatory policing, such as stop and frisk policies and racial profiling, have disproportionately harmed Black communities. Addressing these issues requires a fundamental shift in how policing is approached. Officers must be trained to recognize and confront their biases, and departments must adopt policies that actively work to eliminate racial disparities in arrests, sentencing, and use of force. Education is another critical component of long-term reform. Schools and universities should incorporate lessons on policing, systemic racism, and civil rights into their curricula. By educating future generations about the historical context of law enforcement and its impact on marginalized communities, society can foster a culture that values justice and equity. Encouraging civic engagement and informing citizens of their rights during police interactions can also empower communities to demand fair treatment and accountability. Media representation plays a significant role in shaping public perceptions of law enforcement and police misconduct. Biased reporting often portrays black individuals as criminals while framing officers accused of misconduct as isolated, bad apples. This narrative minimizes the systemic nature of police corruption and reinforces harmful stereotypes. Holding media outlets accountable for fair and accurate reporting is essential in changing public perceptions and ensuring that stories of police misconduct receive the attention they deserve. Social media has become an important tool in exposing instances of injustice, allowing individuals to document and share encounters with law enforcement in real time. Financial incentives can also drive change within police departments. Municipalities should tie funding to accountability measures, rewarding departments that implement effective oversight policies and penalizing those that fail to address misconduct. Redirecting resources toward community-based safety initiatives, mental health services, and education can help reduce the need for aggressive policing tactics. Additionally, departments that consistently demonstrate a commitment to ethical policing should be prioritized for funding and support. Political leadership plays a vital role in driving reform efforts. Elected officials must be held accountable for enacting policies that promote justice and transparency in law enforcement. Voter participation in local elections is crucial, as police chiefs, district attorneys, and other key decision makers often have significant influence over policing policies. Advocating for leaders who prioritize accountability and community engagement is essential in creating a more just legal system. While legislative and institutional changes are necessary, individual actions also play a crucial role in addressing police misconduct. Citizens must remain vigilant in holding law enforcement accountable by documenting interactions, supporting victims of police brutality, and advocating for policy changes. Community organizations and grassroots movements have been instrumental in pushing for reforms, and their efforts must be supported through donations, volunteer work, and active participation in advocacy campaigns. International perspectives on policing can also offer valuable insights into potential reforms. Many countries have implemented alternative approaches to law enforcement that prioritize community engagement and conflict resolution over militarized tactics. Learning from successful models abroad can help inform policies that reduce violence and improve relationships between police and the communities they serve. Ultimately, real change requires sustained effort and collaboration from individuals, organizations, and institutions. Reforming law enforcement is not a quick fix. It demands a long-term commitment to justice, transparency, and community empowerment. By continuing to challenge corruption, advocate for policy changes, and support those affected by police misconduct, society can move toward a future where law enforcement truly serves and protects all people, regardless of race or background. The fight for justice must remain relentless, ensuring that progress is not only achieved but maintained for generations to come.